Okay, well, I'll just get started. Um, Everyone can hear me. Um, I'm happy to be here today and give this talk on inequality and sorting and equilibrium in education markets. The talk is going to be primarily talking about evidence and high-level discussion of the different channels that operate, drawing on experiences from Latin America. That is the context that I'm most familiar with and the one that I have been working on for the last 10 years. So I'm a professor at Princeton University, affiliate to MBR, the JPAL network, and I'm also an NGO that I founded called Consumer Buds. So as a quick start, you've probably seen a graph of this type at some point during this week, basically relating GDP per capita and learning outcomes. And so I just wanted to start with this like international inequality in learning outcomes that's associated to resources and income. But there's some other stuff going on as well as there's a lot of people off diagonal. Why did I want to start with this? Because right after doing this, I want to talk about the main theme of the talk is to think about the inequality in access that's conditional on your country's income. It's the inequality in access to educational opportunities that's within the country. So there's different access to these educational inputs and outcomes that come independently of how rich or poor the country is. There's additionally inequality within the country. And this is generally characterized by students from richer or more educated families tend to have better learning outcomes. But this isn't just, this has to do with, typically has to do with a combination of things. And the one that we'll be talking more about here has to do with the more and better access to inputs. And so they had better opportunities to learn because they had better schools and better beyond their better initial condition. Now, the second kind of theme that I want to talk about is that thinking about this problem of inequality is a pretty broad problem, and many different areas of sciences and think about this. But in economics, we have a standard supply and demand framework to think about equilibrium conditions and considerations that I believe, and I'll argue today, that are helpful for understanding the observed allocation that we see in education markets, observed inequalities and the assignments that we see and the overall quality in general. There's some insights we can gain just from thinking about supply and demand in a standard, modern, but standard setting where there's imperfect competition, different aspects. So it's not Econ 101, but this is not something that is making any differentiation. However, in addition, in education, there's specific frictions that can exacerbate inequality that are also important to take into account, and that those are important to bring into the picture as well. And I'll be talking about the potential for the production function to have be a function of who is consuming the good with the people that are consuming it, so peer effects, and also potentially preferences that over peers for other reasons that could also generate frictions or different costs for teaching different types of kids, and things that can lead us to finding differences in education, as well as other types of market frictions. The last thing I wanted to talk about is applications of this framework to thinking about how we can understand the inequality and the sorting that we see in education markets, the framework and the evidence that we have so far that gives us confidence in this way of thinking about the problem can help us identify potential things coming down the road and kind of give policy advice. So I wanted to discuss quickly at the end of the talk applications to what we might expect COVID-19 might bring in respect to inequality and sorting. And also a recent trend in the growth in investment in Edtech, which is not uncorrelated to COVID-19, but that has a different set of effects potentially on what we might think will happen with inequality and sorting, and what kind of policies we might want to implement given our framework and what we've learned so far about what might happen. So I want to start off with, I guess, one example. You could do this for most any country and you'll find something similar, where if you show the share, this is basically shows the share of low socioeconomic status students at a school. This is like a histogram of schools, conditional on them being public or private. And so if you look at on the right of the graph, the schools that have 100% school students of low socioeconomic status, the majority of those are public. Now, within the private schools, there's still some privates, in this context is the context of Chile, that have, all the kids are low socioeconomic status. So there's a skew to the right of more poverty, more concentration of low socioeconomic students to the right, suggesting that public schools have proportionally more poor students. But there's a lot of heterogeneity here. Now, some of this has to do with some of the inequality we might be worried about has to do with resources. This graph shows the average spending per teacher. So it's the total expenditure on teachers at the school divided by the number of teachers on the x-axis. So that's in thousands of dollars a year. And on the y-axis, we have an estimate of value added, or increased learning that students get on the standardized tests. So you see here is that there's an upward slope. So schools that spend more on teachers seem to have higher value added. A second thing that's interesting from this graph is that there's a difference between private subsidized schools and public schools, in the sense that at every level of spending, there's mostly a higher level for private voucher schools. And the third thing to note is the slope. And the slope is important because if you note on the left, on the very left of the graph, there's a public school that doesn't spend a lot and a private school that doesn't spend a lot, and they're equally not very good in terms of value added. And so there is a sense where money seems to matter everywhere. And that's like another source of potential inequality, because some schools, private voucher schools, are going to have potentially more resources to spend because they charge copays in the context of Chile. Now, moving to the context of Dominican Republic, this is another way where education access can be unequal. Public schools in the Dominican Republic prior or recent reform where you could have multiple shifts in a day. So the hours of instruction that you would get at a public school were reduced because we needed to use the building to do another group of students in the afternoon. So some would have morning, some would afternoon, some even had the late evening or night, and very few had a full day of education, whereas private schools would have slightly less than a full day, but they'd have more hours of instruction. And to get access to those more hours of instruction, in this context, you'd have to pay out-of-pocket fee to go to a private school. So you could get inequality in learning outcomes. You could get inequality in hours of instruction. Going back to context of Chile, and this is a rendering of a map of Santiago, Chile, where you can see that there's the segregation in basically urbans were, across the urbans, probably a city of millions of inhabitants. So it's a very large space, and the dark darker red is there's more concentration of low socioeconomic students or that have more disadvantaged students. And the dark blue part areas are areas where there's much less disadvantaged students. And so there's a part of this segregation and inequality that's spatial as well. And we'll see that that plays a role in access to education when education is such a local thing. So these are characteristics of the schools, and you can see on the left, like student outcomes are much higher. And the green is like a higher on the top left map of Santiago with math test scores. You have the top green happens to be the same area where there was less poor students. And so you're seeing there's some sorting and segregation in outcomes and residential locations, as well as other characteristics of the schools that are correlated with socioeconomic status. Now, this is important to the extent that the residential segregation and sorting is important. In the United States and other developing countries, sometimes the schools and access to education is associated to your neighborhood by regulation. Typically in developing countries, that's not implemented both for feasibility and it's just never come up. I think it's just very hard to implement. But in fact, education seems to be something that people, it's a locally consumed good. It's something that, time and space is people dislike traveling very far. So these are two examples from centralized assignment systems that have been implemented last couple of years in Ecuador. And then I have another one for Peru coming up where this just shows you how far people go or want to go for their first choice. So this is like the first, it's not where they actually end up going necessarily, but it's where do you want to go? So people don't want to go to schools that are very far from their house. So typically people want to go at least less than 2 kilometers, which is problematic if everything around you is of a different, has different inputs and different quality than if you lived in another area. So that's Ecuador. Here, this is Peru in particular. This is the city of Tacna, Peru, where we can again see kind of what people's first preference was. So typically they don't want to go to anything further away than 20-minute drive or, 3 kilometer drive. And finally, another aspect I think that is, since we're talking about differences across space, differences across types of education and like hours. This graph is just to kind of show the relevance of the private sector in general in Latin America. In urban areas, the number of students that attend private schools that are funded privately is quite large. It's above 40% in all these main, large urban city areas, suggesting that if we want to study sorting and inequality, and we want to study how to get people better access to education, you can't ignore or leave out of the picture a large private sector. And a private sector typically is, in the developed country context, isn't as regulated as it would be in a developed country. Now, in the context, Santiago is in Chile here is much higher, and they've been doing a subsidized voucher system for many years, since 1980. And so that's over 40 years of that, and you have a larger share. But even places like Lima or Buenos Aires or Bogota, Santo Domingo, those don't have subsidies. And that means there's a significant middle class that attends private schools and they pay out of pocket for those things. Now, to put that into context, I think it's useful to look at the percentage of students that go to some sort of private provision for education in Haiti, which is even higher than Chile, even though Chile is the one that has the subsidized voucher, which suggests that part of this isn't just the subsidization on the side of the government subsidizing the demand for education, such that there'll be more private provision, but also on the supply side, if the government has difficulty providing services, you might see more private provision as families themselves, look for options. So basically, this is an introduction. We can't really think about sorting and segregation without thinking about demand and supply, and in this case, a lot of the private sector. Going back to the Dominican Republic, just to show you the heterogeneity you can find in penetration and market structure. So these are urban markets that have been put together using basic census data about urban areas. And what the color indicates is what percent of the market share is private. And so the bigger areas have larger, more red, but not always the case. So Santo Domingo and Santiago have, 40%, 40% plus share of private sector. And you have some cities that aren't that big that have a lot of private, and other cities that have very little private. So these, if we want to understand kind of where people end up and what generates the differences, it's interesting to note how heterogeneous different markets can end up being. It also suggests that market structure is endogenous in this industry, as it is typically the case. So how can we use economics to think about education policy and the way that inequality and sorting can play out and what we can do about it? So the first is these building blocks that we get from economics, and we can kind of bring them to bear to this question and think about, well, what is going on? So the first is we can characterize very simply, before we start making this more complicated, we could think of families. They have to make choices, and they're optimizing some objective, like the welfare of their family or something related to that. But they have to do that subject to constraints. And those constraints can include a variety of things. It could be financial constraints. It could be, lack of information about options. They could have biased beliefs about options. They could have a limited choice set. They could get discriminated at some options, and so those aren't available to them. So we could use the very basic setup from economics to think about the individual family's decision if we had data on these different aspects that they're facing in their choices. At the same time, you could imagine schools or organizations or groups of people that make choices and they optimize some objective function, and they have to do that subject to constraints. You could have a variety of objectives. Your objective could be to make the kids learn as much as possible, or your objective could be to maximize profit, as entrepreneurs do in other industries of the economy. And you might have constraints related to the production function, the input markets that you have access to. You could have managers that are not very sophisticated or not very efficient, and maybe they have biased beliefs about what are the right way to combine inputs. So all that is kind of familiar from other settings. And then you've got the government that can either directly provide services. In this case, public provision would be public schools is very common. It can regulate the provision of others by regulating, for example, minimum quality standards, or it could regulate the use of certain inputs, like, for example, certification of workers in the industry, or it could regulate what types of things can be done in the process of, what production functions can be used. It could also subsidize the demand. It could subsidize what people pay out of pocket for the good, and it could also subsidize inputs or provide access to financial to credit to participants. So these are the combination of rules and regulations that define or modify the choices and trade-offs that faced by both firms and consumers. So digging a little more deeper into each of these pieces. So you think about the demand side from the families. Families are thinking about again, we're trying to understand why we would see this big set, these kind of very different sets of types of schools that kids will go to. So we're trying to understand what could have led people to end up in these very different schools. So a very basic set part, you could say, well, maybe it's their preferences. Like the people they just like different things. This is like the first thing you might think. And so you say, well, maybe their preferences are the trade-offs that people make when they're deciding whether acquiring education, going to a particular school that has like better inputs or something, relative to other uses of their time and resources. Maybe they don't like it as much, so they don't want to pay as much. Or maybe they don't want to travel as far. And so you can imagine, this is just for the sake of argument. I'm not kind of saying this is the case, but you could say preferences could be leading people to do different things. A second aspect is related to the constraints that people face. This starts to seem more natural when we're thinking about when we were looking at those original graphs. We're seeing that richer people were going to better schools that had more inputs, and poor people were going to ones that weren't. And so constraints could be the different sets of feasible alternatives that you can guide your choices. Like what's available to me could be available things. Constraints could be financial, like I can't afford to pay for something, or it could be that I can't go there because they won't let me in, or there's just nothing around. Like the choice set of things that are around me aren't any good. Now, beliefs and information is a pretty broad net that captures lots of things, but you could imagine that people could be wrong about the world in different ways. And it's not like they didn't care about education, but maybe they thought, for example, it didn't matter so much when you go to kindergarten. And so then they're thinking maybe when my kid goes to high school, then they'll go to a good school and then it'll be great. So they actually care about it, but they think it doesn't matter so much when they're kids, when typically the evidence that we know of in education economics is that early childhood has a very investment in human capital. Early childhood has a very high return. So families could have wrong beliefs about that, and that could lead them to underinvest in education, like maybe travel less far to go to a school or pay less money to go to a better school. It could also be, so that would be something like about how much weight they put on quality at some stage. But it could also be information about what the characteristics of the options are. Like they might think that a school is really good, but it's not really good. It's actually just looks like it's good. And so there could be differences in what information families have when they're making these choices. You could imagine from introspection, typically more educated families and social groups will be accustomed to interacting with higher levels of education such that information about those options is more readily available without having to do any effort. You just get it because you're just near people. Whereas other people are in a context where the information is more costly to acquire. You have to actively look for it. So there's beliefs or information about how important these characteristics are, about what they are. And finally, there could be just differences in information about what options exist. Like you just never heard of an option, so you didn't choose it. But it wasn't that you didn't think it was, if you would have known it existed, you would have chosen it, for example. So all that set up, we've got preference and we've got constraints, and we have basically biased beliefs and heterogeneous information sets that could shift the way people make decisions. And these things can potentially interact with each other. And they interact with policy as well. So policies that the government can implement can both interact with these, and they can do things in interesting and strange ways that could be unexpected. And so it's important to keep each of these in mind. Now, also, the other side of this market are the providers. So we could think about these as schools, daycares, colleges, whatever, all these organizations, be they public, private, something intermediate. They all make choices regarding, something about how much effort to put in, or, what types, they have some choices available to them, to the manager of these things. And in particular, when they're private, they have a broader set of choices that could be everything from where to locate, whether to close, whether to enter, how much to invest in their capacity, like should they expand, what kind of inputs should they hire, and what kind of, how much, what maybe potentially who to admit or who not to admit, and what prices to charge. And you could imagine policy as being a set of rules and regulations that could restrict some of these choices potentially to different degrees. And so we could characterize these participants, these organizations in particular. One way to do it is to think about, well, what's their objective function? They could be maximizing profits like any other retail service provider, or they could have some other objective, like maybe making the kids learn more, or maybe getting people to believe in a certain religion or have certain values. You could have different objectives. These schools also face constraints. They can face constraints like their input markets that are available to them, like where I have to hire teachers, but I don't have any teacher available, or the ones that are available are of a certain quality, and the prices that they face are what they are in the market. It could also be the production function that they have. They might just be, this is what they have to do. They may not be very sophisticated. They might have difficulties adopting new technology. They might, have, different ways of combining, infrastructure and books and computers and people into their learning process. And so those are constraints that they have to do, say, how much do I put into each of these things? They also have beliefs and information frictions potentially as well. And so this is like well documented in many areas in development where people do, investments that aren't optimal sometimes, and they might not use the right fertilizer. So it's not crazy to believe that some schools in developing countries where none of the participants inside the organization are very sophisticated, they could be making mistakes potentially in what they're doing. And those could be systematically affecting the quality of the market or a whole area. And so they could potentially have biased beliefs or biased behavior, discriminatory behavior against certain groups of the population as well. And those could be incorrect potentially as well. And all this also, again, interacts with policy, because policy is going to determine a lot of the constraints that the schools face and the trade-offs that they make when they're participating on either the input market or the consumer market. Now, having kind of given that kind of high-level overview of these different elements that, both demand and supply, we're thinking of a very econ framework. So we're trying to get as far as we can with just that. There are some things that are specific to education. And it's important to keep them in mind because they're not going to be captured, or they're not going to be something that's first order or that they could lead to first order deviations from the model that we're starting to sketch out. I mean, one of the things that is pretty important is that when people are participating in education markets and they're buying services to acquire human capital, the skills and the learning that they get are embodied, and they can't rent those out. They can rent out those skills, but they can't sell them. And this is going to be important to one of the things that we're going to worry about, because we can't it's going to generate the fact that we can't, people can't take away my learning if I don't pay them back, for example, for loaning me money to acquire these skills. So human capital is embodied. I can't sell it. You can't take it from me. So it's going to make it harder to get access to financial markets for that. So you're going to have missing markets for human capital. The other thing is that education is a highly differentiated product. There's all kinds of different aspects to it. And this can lead to interesting markets with a lot of heterogeneity and like potentially differentiated products that have small bits of market power through the just differentiation. The most natural one is the differentiation of space. Like a school that's further away is different from a school that's near to you just because of space. But it could have different, there's a vertical part that you might think that everybody prefers learning more or learning less. But you could also think that the types of learning are very different. And so that's something that is, that something makes this different. Education can produce externalities, and these are kind of familiar, I think, to most people here, but you could think that there's a lot of different reasons that education could generate social good beyond the privately, that's going to give private returns. The most classic one is just have informed voters that know what's going on. We need them to be educated so that our democracy can work. There's this part that I mentioned earlier as well, that education is a technology that you need the person to participate in it. And so you can't just kind of like send a check and then they send you a chip and you plug it in. I was going to make a reference to the Matrix, but I'm assuming that most people here might have not been born when it was made. So I'm just going to be like, not going to make that. And so you need custom input to get in here. And this is related to things like peer effects or other things that, something that makes this a different type of production technology that complicate things. So in this particular case, if other people that are consuming the product or consuming the service together with you change the value of it or change the amount of education being provided or the increase in human capital is provided, it's going to make us deviate from the basic setup that we're using to think about this. So for these reasons, I mean, many others, and for particular externalities, you typically have governments with a large presence in education markets, either through direct provision, which is the most common in developed countries, but also by subsidizing demand in different ways. I mean, typically in developing countries, we talk about vouchers, but there's all kinds of ways where this demand is subsidized through tax rebates or, different types of subsidized way, providing loans that are subsidized, et cetera. And then there's all kinds of regulation that I've kind of mentioned before, everything from what kind of inputs can be used, where and when you can buy these inputs, certification of all the workers that participate in the market, and certification of the different levels of what's being done. And these things can help a lot potentially on the part where there's information frictions, but they could maybe hinder choices of the organization providing services that isn't allowed to make some choices that they might otherwise want to make. So with that, we've got a basic framework. We've got a basic framework of demand, and we have supply. And we're trying to think about these equilibrium outcomes where some people are ending up with very different types of education provision. Some are ending up with low amounts of quality and learning, and others are not. And so we can basically, very straightforwardly, start saying, well, resources can matter, and we could start working our way down the list. But let's try to think about, put ourselves in the case of, okay, why might some individuals underinvest? So imagine everybody, conditional on their preferences, has an optimal amount that they should invest in. And that could be different because of preferences. But for the sake of argument, let's assume preferences are the same. And now we want to start saying, okay, if preferences are the same, everybody wants their kid to do great. And faced with the same trade-offs, they'd make the similar choices. So why would some individuals underinvest in education while others do not? And so one classic reason is that we'll have differences in income or wealth. But that if we had similar preferences and we're doing something that's privately it's an investment. So that just having less income less money wouldn't really fully explain that. But if you have different access to credit, or everyone's credit constrained, and you have different levels of wealth, you'll get different amounts of investment in human capital. And now it's when this particularity of this type of capital, this human capital, is embodied, and it's difficult to collateralize. So this is going to make it so that this can't get resolved on its own in a market setting. And because, by the way, we're working hard to not deviate from the market settings, because it's pretty easy to deviate, just find lots of reasons why everything is screwed. So we're trying to go little by little. So in this case, since education is embodied, it's difficult to collateralize. Any differences in wealth or initial income of your parents are going to potentially generate differences in investment. And some people could be underinvesting in their education, while others that don't face, they have money on hand to use, they can basically self-finance their investment. They're going to get more education, and others are going to get less. So individuals that are unable to make the appropriate investments are going to have underinvestment, and their education levels are going to be inefficient. And everyone's going to know it's inefficient, but we can't do anything about it because there's no way to get resources that then you can then provide, pay back. Another potential reason, even though you have the same preferences and you have everything's the same, so you would choose the similar amount of education if everything else were equal, you could have underinvestment because of biased beliefs about the returns to investment, for example. Biased beliefs could matter for lots of ways, but this is one where, just as in other areas of development, people underestimate the return on some investments, like things in health or things in agriculture and education. We've been seeing, plenty of evidence over the last 10 years, say, of papers finding that people seem to underinvest to underestimate the returns to education. And so if that's true, then the individuals will make won't make the appropriate amount of investment in education that they would have made had they known the true potential outcome for them had they gotten the education level. So note that these are both two things that are like separate from preferences. Like, you could imagine that if people just had different preferences, then we tautologically immediately go to having different amounts. But that wouldn't be very interesting to just explain all the differences just because people have different preferences. It's probably unlikely and not really sustained from the data. So we're looking at two very straight up things that if you don't have access to credit or you have biased beliefs about the returns of education, you might not do the right investments. I'll add that the biased beliefs one in my own kind of work, I think that this plays a really big role because a lot of the educational investments are dynamic and they interact with each other. So if you are thinking about the return, you're thinking it would be really important for somebody to go to a certain major, study a certain thing because they make a lot of money or they have a really successful, a meaningful life, they'll have choices to do something they really like. And so as a father, you want your kid to get to that point, and you work yourself back from that point all the way to when they're very little, and you're thinking, I need to get this kid the right investment in his human capital so that then later they can do well and make choices along the way. Those dynamic interactions, or the dynamic complementarities of investment, can prove to be really important. And if your beliefs are biased, you could lead to very small changes. You think it's not such a big deal. And then that would lead you to make less of these investments that then interact with future investments. So this is something I think that there's a pretty interesting avenue where things that aren't that big could actually end up having big impacts. Okay, so now let's think about So, I mean, that's not an exhaustive list of reasons why people would end up underinvesting, but let's now think about schools. Like, why would some schools be worse than others in terms of learning outcomes? And again, let's try to put ourselves in the position of, not just, straight away, just like by like, oh, of course they're going to be different because, everything's different. So let's start by saying like, what could be going wrong? Like under all else equal, what can we do? So this biased beliefs can come up as well. I think I want to do that. So biased beliefs could come up here as well. But this could be levels of sophistication. It could be different, the conditional on having the same preferences. You could just have different levels of, efficiency or human capital or something like that could lead to different outcomes. But you can have people that are exactly the same. They're just not aware of the, right way or what things to invest in. And I'll tie this back into, I've been thinking about this more recently, thinking about Edtech and adoption of new technology that seems to be having high returns for learning outcomes. And you wonder why these aren't being adopted faster. And some schools are the ones that adopt them quite quickly, and others do not. And it could be resources, but some of these things don't cost a lot of money. So it might be that they don't know that they exist, or they're not sure if they'll work, etc. Another thing that I've personally worked on quite a bit has to do with different schools. Everything else is the same, but they just have different levels of market power. In a sense, what I mean by market power, I mean the ability to provide less quality or less learning than they would have if they were in perfect competition. So like if I reduce the learning by a little bit, say we don't work as hard, or we don't, put in some Saturdays to get the curriculum just right, and like we follow up with a kid that's falling behind, we just don't do that extra effort, then you might lose students because somebody else will provide that extra effort. If that's not really going to happen, and you can slack off a little bit, potentially having market power to like either, you could have a higher price, or you could have a lower quality. In this case, lower quality could be something that explains differences in two schools that are identical in every other way. It's just that their environment is different. And then I think one thing that's kind of interesting in developing countries is a generalized lack of access to financial capital, credit markets in general to do profitable investments is something that I think is also being apparent, and I'll talk about a little later, that during COVID, the private sector, if you don't have access to credit, then you have difficulty dealing with shocks. You also have difficulty acquiring, profitable investments. Like maybe what I need is to get internet, and that way I can add a really cool learning app that all the kids will learn, and then everybody will love it, and then they'll want to pay an extra $1 to come to school, and then I can pay off the investment. But if I can't get the money to front the investment initially, I won't be able to do that, or I won't be able to like go on a limb and hire some better teachers that are going to do some after school stuff. And then next year, we're going to get more parents coming to the school because we made this investment. So if you don't have access to credit, that will reduce the chances for making productive investments and improving the quality of the school. And this could be heterogeneous in the population. There could be some areas where richer communities potentially are going to be able to like self-insure shocks or like provide credit, whereas other communities that are poor won't be able to do that. So these missing capital markets can make it harder to raise funds, and it will be harder to organize inputs and provide services, even if everybody values them. So it's not about biased beliefs, it's not about market power. Like everybody wants to do it, we just don't have the ability to raise enough resources to put these things together. So what I want to do here, I didn't do like a full description of each paper, but I did want to talk briefly about what evidence we have about alleviating these different channels that could be leading to inequality in outcomes in the kind of the sorting that we see in the data. So the most natural one, as an economist, the most natural thing is to think, well, the prices are different and people's ability to pay those different prices could be the thing that's leading them to make different choices. Something's more expensive, then you pay more, and something that's less expensive, you pay less. So it's like potentially less valuable, or there's less resources to make something better. So in perfect competition, these different prices would be associated with different qualities. So if we subsidize demand, people could acquire the better level of quality, assuming they have the same preferences and everything else is the same. So an early RCT by a set of very famous authors in the context of Colombia provided vouchers to very poor students, and particularly it's a small group of very poor students. And these students, with the students that received vouchers, improved learning outcomes relative to the ones that didn't. Oh, this came out on the same slide. So another paper, sorry, let me go back 1 second. So we could imagine this is, and then there's some follow-up work, I think that's ongoing. I'm not familiar with the details, but basically this is something that you might think is expected. If you thought it was just their preferences, if you gave them a voucher and lowered the prices, maybe if they just didn't like education, they might have not cared because they had to travel further or whatever. But it could, if you give them a voucher and they, can do better, you're like, well, something good happened there. Now, the tricky thing here is sometimes when we do an RCT like this, you have to think about what are the mechanisms. When you're giving people a voucher, you're subsidizing their co-payment or their tuition in a private school. If they're already going to private school, you've basically given them money because they can save money on the tuition they're already paying. And they can use that money for other things like tutors, or they can use it to just buy food or something. So the interpretation of kind of like what exactly is going on that leads to these positive outcomes, we're not sure, but basically we can say that providing these students the voucher led to these better outcomes. Now, another study that's quite famous is a difference kind of research design, is a study of the introduction of a countrywide voucher program in Chile. So this paper by Miguel Urquiola and that's mentioned down there below. I put the whole thing there. And they find that if you take the areas, different neighborhoods or different comunas of Chile and look at the ones that had increased entry of private schools once vouchers were provided, those ended up being more segregated across schools within those areas. But you didn't, then the other areas with less entry, but you didn't really see an increase in academic achievement. So they conclude that you get a bunch of segregation because there's more variety in these schools that are being offered, but it's not clear that people are learning more. Now there's some, this is like a very early paper studying a very important policy. There's some limitations to like measurement of learning outcomes from the time that those things have improved a lot right now. And it's not clear what the counterfactual would have been. So the authors try to instrument for the entry of the voucher schools. Now, I've spent some time working on this same kind of context. A little different. The policy that I studied in my PhD thesis is a policy that, on top of the voucher, there had been since the early 90s a co-payment, which generated heterogeneity in how much you had to pay. Some were free and some you had to pay a copay. And this has been attributed by several authors, including the ones I just mentioned, as part of the thing that generates the segregation, because people that can't afford to pay the copay can't go to a school that has much more resources. And that generates differences in quality and in just sorting of different socioeconomic groups. So the policy eliminated the copay, so that the poor students now could go to schools and not have to pay the copay, but it also gave the schools much more money for each person.
So schools are getting more money for poor students, and the students could also leave. So as over a high level review of that paper, what I show is that if you take an empirical IO demand model and you characterize demand, you could then use that to characterize the incentives to compete on the supply side and how those change when this policy is implemented. And with that, you can show that originally, before the new policy was implemented, that the inequality observed was across neighborhoods, across spatial areas, and across social groups is partially explained by differences in market power that have nothing to do with any specific friction in education. It could be explained just by saying these are differentiated products and people with different amounts of resources are more sensitive to price than others and they can't travel as far. And that would give schools in some neighborhoods more market power to lower their quality than schools that are in areas where people are more educated and richer and they can just switch. Now, it doesn't say that the differences are still differences of resources. So resources actually played a big part too. So it was a combination of resources and changing, lowering the differences in market power across neighborhoods that played a part in increasing the quality of schools in the poorest neighborhoods, which then led to closing a gap between students that were in poor neighborhoods versus students that were in more richer neighborhoods. And overall, this policy, and similar to some recent literature on different types in this area, seem to all suggest that the supply side in this context in developing countries where we have so many private providers, the supply side is a big part of both why we have inequality, but also why some policies work, and they work at reducing inequality. And so considering those and thinking about what their objectives are and what their constraints are is important when designing policies to alleviate inequality. And that's basically kind of like, in a nutshell, kind of what I try to do in my research. Now let's move to a different, so here's a different restriction. We talked about earlier, like some of the reasons why people would end up doing different types of education and having different levels of quality of education, and we get segregation in that margin. Part of it was resources, and so we just talked about alleviating the ability to subsidizing demand and getting rid of the cost of the education. Now there's also this part about information frictions and different biases and differences in access to information. So now moving to that, there's now, I guess, several papers. I didn't want to get into one in particular, but there's several papers now that show that information, while not being everything, does, reducing the gaps that people have across information, or like reducing how off they are about different aspects of schools, both the returns to education in general, the characteristics of schools around them, and the availability of schools. So these things seem to lead people to make choices that are more similar to people that are more advantaged, suggesting that we're closing the gap in information leads people to make more similar decisions, which is in line with the idea that preferences weren't that different to begin with. It was more like they had different information about things. So there's now accumulation of some papers. One thing that I think is interesting to think about here is, like, information is a tricky thing when we think about how does this explain the observed sorting equilibrium that we see. So why I think about this? Well, if we scaled up an intervention that provides information to everybody, who's to say that things would get better in terms of segregation and inequality, and maybe they get worse? So for example, if we provided everybody information, imagine the upper middle class parents that are already doing better off are better at absorbing the information and using it and putting it into action. And then they would maybe make even better choices than they were making before, which would potentially, I'm not saying that this is what I think is going to happen, but it could be that you could end up with more inequality than you had initially. And there's other mechanisms through which this could work as well. If there's congestion, because there's schools that are good or could be full, maybe we end up pushing out the few poor students that were already trying to go. So in a follow-up paper, so this got squished together, but and a way to address this scale-up problem, it's very difficult to get at this with an RCT framework. A very nice paper that was covered in an earlier class by the other professors that were teaching education markets in this class. They covered, they had the luck, to look at the role of information at the market level in small villages in Pakistan. But in general, like in large urban settings, like in Latin America, these ginormous cities with 5 million inhabitants, it's kind of difficult to look at equilibrium effects of information provision. So in this, what we do in this paper is that we have a small scale RCT, much like many other papers, where we move the choices of families that are of very poor families. We shift their choices with information, and they make better choices, and the kids learn more. But then here in this paper, we model, we estimate a model of how demand changes when you get information. And also we estimate a model about how schools, in particular for private schools, would change their behavior if their consumers and the demand they faced became more sensitive to quality than they used to be, and they started behaving more like more educated families. And the model estimates are important because we don't know what's going to happen if we scale this up. And we're trying to get a sense of how each individual changing their behavior could aggregate up to a new equilibrium. And so we take from the RCT and we take the aggregate data that we have and all the micro data we have from before, and we estimate a model demand with the RCT. So we try to look at the RCT through the lens of the model and get a demand that's like 4 people that are treated. And that we can extrapolate through the urban landscape across to poor families all over the place. And we can then see like what has happened in the past when schools face more competition and parents start to leave the school because you're not improving your quality. You start to face a demand that's more elastic to quality. Well, how would that change? How much do they change? And so we use use other policy changes and administrative data to try to get at that. We put these things together and we get, under different sets of assumptions, interesting ways of extrapolating out what might happen if we did an equilibrium policy, what would the new equilibrium would be. And what you get is some interesting interactions, for example, in the short run, and they all kind of make sense ex post. But as you're doing these exercises with the model, it's helpful for thinking about the mechanisms, if not like what you think is actually exactly going to happen. So one thing that you might imagine instantly all the poor families are alerted to the fact that there's some good schools nearby, and they also now care about them in the sense that they realize that the returns to education are high, so they care about their kids, so they should find a good school. So they all rush for the good schools, but there's not that many of those good schools around in their neighborhoods. And so you could just get a lot of congestion. And those schools, if they're for profit, could raise their prices to get rid of excess demand. So you could get to it. In the initial part, you might get to a worse outcome in the sense that the higher price is going to shift out the poor people that were trying to go there in the first place. Now, at the same time, in the medium run, you might think that the higher prices will lead to investment and will lead to expansion of these better schools, or more lead to entry of new types of schools in these neighborhoods. So that those neighborhoods start to look more similar to the neighborhoods in other areas because their people's willingness to pay has gone up because they care more about education. Now, in practice, we found that there was sufficient amount of supply that if you had a centralized assignment such that the schools wouldn't be allowed to choose who gets to come, when there's excess demand, you could manage this relatively well in the context of Chile in this period. But it was important to do the full working this out, because in the original impact was actually half the effect of the RCT because of congestion and people pushing other people out of the slots. So in the long run, we recover bigger effects than the RCT, but in the short run, we had much smaller effects. Again, the supply side is playing an important role here because it could have gone up, it could have gone down, and all depended on how much the supply is going to react to this change. Okay, so I'm actually doing quite well on time, and so I'm going to talk about two kind of forward-looking policies or things that are happening now that we could use as a framework to think about what we think might happen. So first one is about thinking about COVID-19. So COVID-19 is going to catch a bunch of, the industry as a whole in developing countries providing education. It catches them with a very limited ability to provide education services through digital channels. There's been very little investment in digital before the COVID-19. And so a big chunk of the market is just not going to be able to provide services very effectively during this period. And people are gonna do their best they can. There's a lot of people trying really hard to help the kids, but they're just not ready for this. However, the well-funded private schools, so well-funded private schools that were there from before had been advancing a little quicker on adopting digital technology. They had a little heads up, and they have deeper pockets and the ability to get access to financial markets to make it loans and invest. So these schools invest and adopt new technology, and their kids are learning during COVID, which are the wealthier students that can afford the tuition at these schools, while the rest have to make do with limited capacities. And this, you could imagine, exacerbates learning gaps. So this kind of makes sense, and this is kind of a basic thing, because these other schools will have limited access to financial markets to make investments, and public schools might have other frictions. In addition, you could also imagine that the shock that hit families, COVID, is going to hit different types of families in different ways. There's no paper on this, by the way. I'm just working through it, like the thought process of like how I would use the framework to think about it, and then as an example. So we could think, well, families are being hit with an income shock. Like many people are losing their jobs, but not everybody. The people that can work from home, people that are more educated, are getting hit less because they can work from home, and it's not that big a deal. But services and jobs like construction and things that you have to like be out there working, some of those jobs are going to get hit considerably. And in developing countries, that's a big chunk of this, middle class. It's not really like the traditional developed country middle class, but people that have consistent income are going to lose that income. And these are the families are the ones that are paying to go to private schools in this context where private schools that are just for the middle class and not really for the super rich people. So these people are being hit with income shocks, and so they're making choices. They're like, well, the quality of the schooling is worse because the school doesn't have digital capabilities. I have less money, so I can't pay tuition. So I have an option available to me that's free, and it's not necessarily very good, but this one isn't good either, and I don't have any money. And so you could imagine there's a bunch of movement from the private sector, this like middle, this the 40% of private schools, that people that go to private schools, a big chunk of that isn't really fancy private schools, and they're going to get hit with a shock. And as these people are leaving, you could imagine that private schools, as we were talking about earlier, they have to make decisions on different margins. And one of those margins is whether to stay in business or close. And it's like, if you're losing families, but you have big fixed costs because you have to continue to pay salaries and you have to pay rent for your building or pay on the loan for the building, and you can't make any revenue because everything's closed. You could see that they might find it the best case, the best way to move forward is to close those schools. And that would move people to the public schools that didn't even want to leave the schools, but they have to because their school's closing. And as we're doing this, the schools that are not closing, that have parents with stable incomes, are acquiring new technology and the kids are learning and they're getting instruction. While other schools are closing, kids are having to switch schools, go to public school, and the kids in public school are now have way more students there, and the public school wasn't used to having so many students. You can imagine that their learning is going down. And so as a conjunction of these different things, you could imagine that there'll be increasing inequality between the most well-off students and the rest of the population. That's not just because of the part where people are not getting instruction, which was the first point, but because we're destroying some of the schools that were pretty good. They just weren't good at doing digital, and the parents that went there lost their retail jobs, for example, are closing. And the schools the other schools are now getting overcrowded. Even if it's digital and it's at home, they're going to potentially have more students per teachers. And so you could see that the inequality between these groups are going to change. Now, we're still not done with the equilibrium, because you could imagine now that somebody that used to be okay with their public school, because it was a pretty good public school, now they might think, look, this quality has gone down so much. Now, actually, I want to pay to go to a private school. You start getting this additional sorting on the parents that care about quality. And they might have not cared about other aspects that were different across public and private, but now they do because of quality. Now, I cut off, you can't see this because I wrote too much on the slide, but the policy that you might think would be helpful now, see, I try to get there, I'll stay here and I'll just say the policy. You could imagine that the policy that could help, there are multiple things you could do as a policymaker, and they probably want to do a combination of these things. Not all closure of the private schools is bad. Some of those schools might have needed to close. But if you think that there's lack of access to financial capital to smooth over the shock, you might be losing some schools that are actually very productive and they're doing a good job of educating people. So those schools you might want to provide loans for. You might also want to stop people from switching schools so much, so you might give them a subsidy so they don't have to pay tuition. That would help the schools stay open. And you might want to expand public supply and invest in the public schools' capacity to do digital. There are economies of scale that you might think that could operate there, that the government would have advantages in providing infrastructure for digital education, such that you'd be in a better situation to receive future shocks if we have to go in and do quarantine again in the future. So you could do a combination of these things, try to provide funding and save the best providers, give people, help people out so they don't have to switch from their school, and then also try to expand the public supply to fill in the spot where these like more precarious private schools were providing services. So that's like one application. See, I don't have any evidence, but I do know, actually, I do know here that in the context of Peru, in the context of Colombia and Mexico and other Latin American countries where we have a big sector of private schools, many of those private schools have indeed closed. And daycares and pre-Ks that are there as well have closed because they couldn't survive. What's interesting is in the context of Chile that has a subsidized voucher, the closures seem to have been much less of an issue, because the voucher system is basically acting as an automatic stabilizer, if you will, for the industry. Like the industry as a wide is getting hit with a shock, and the government continues to pay the subsidy independently if you're at home or not, so the schools can survive and weather the storm. Whereas in other places, they're not able to do Now, we don't know much about that, but that would be a great topic for people to study, is what's happening with the restructuring of these industries and these different markets. What's going to happen after the dust settles. Now, as a last application, I think another thing that's happening is there's been this burst in investment in Edtech over the last 10 years. We've basically gone in 10 years, we've basically gone from 3 billion investment into 400 different, in organizations or groups of people trying to come up with new ways for kids to learn, to 15 billion last December, and 4 times or 3 times more groups of people investing. So I think a big chunk of this is COVID making everyone think, we have to do learning, we have to invest in figuring out ways to learn online in a digital format, and also a lot of investments being done to get rid of the precursors that were stopping adoption, like internet access and devices have expanded dramatically during COVID. So the returns to coming up with a new idea in EdTech is really important. So basically, we have a bunch of money and a bunch of smart people working really hard on coming up with new things that are going to get people to learn. And a lot of these things might not be that good, but some of them are going to be probably good. Like, this is kind of what humans do. We put our heads together to solve a problem, get a bunch of money on there, and we come up with a vaccine for COVID, for example. Well, somebody's going to come up with something that is going to lead kids to learn more. Now, the problem with that, and why I'm bringing it up here, is that during COVID, we've seen the access to new technology and adoption and being connected isn't equal across. And even though we're making inroads and adopting, more digital focused learning tools, there's still a gap, and that gap is potentially going to get wider because as innovation is advancing, new things are coming along. If adoption of those new things isn't keeping up with the rate of innovation, we're going to get increasing inequality and increased sorting across groups in these societies that we're studying, because of their capability to adopt and acquire new technology as it comes through. And we're going to get larger achievement gaps because some groups have all the infrastructure and are quicker to figure out which new thing is good and which isn't, implemented, learn, while the other group is falling, is going to be, even though they're advancing, they could be falling behind in terms of the gap. And so I'm basically making a reference to the famous book by Claudia Goldin and Larry Katz on the race between technology and education. Here it's the race between innovation and digital adoption. And so this investment in EdTech, you could already see, if we think schools have these frictions and they have difficulty making the right choices, and they have biased beliefs, or they have lack of access to financial markets, or any of the things that we talked about earlier that might make different types of schools put them at a disadvantage in terms of acquiring new technology and spreading it to their students, we might get more inequality and larger achievement gaps. And so this policy implication for this is that, it's important because we have inequality now. Everybody's kind of aware of that. But what this suggests that this would be increasing over time if we don't continually increase our investment to close the gap in the speed at which things are adopted, not just, did you get internet now and were you able to use Zoom? So here you can imagine the policy, some sort of policy would be to invest in the connectivity, but do this in a continuous way, and incentivize adoption, and maybe develop ways to certify different types of things, or to spread out things that have proven to be good. We may invest in figuring out what's good and what's not. Just like we invest in doing COVID vaccine RCT trials, we invest in ways of figuring out what things are good and what things aren't. And when they're good, we try to get them to everybody as fast as possible. And we have to make a big effort to do this until the disadvantaged groups that are slower to adopt have caught up. So I guess, I mean, since the format of not taking any questions during it, so I've had a few minutes left over, but this is the end of my talk. I wanted to recap by saying that we can use economics to think about these education markets. We can use our empirical tools to think about how to do RCTs, how to learn about, learn evidence, and also how to use models of behavior from both on the demand and supply side to get insights about what we think might happen. We have to take into account that in some cases, in some questions, the frictions that are specific to education markets, like peer effects and others that we talked about, could be irrelevant, and we take those into account. But that over and over again, recently, the equilibrium effects, which are the ones that most matter for sorting and for this inequality we see in the aggregate, are really important. And the supply side plays a big part of the story. So we need to take them into account because we're in a developing country context where the government has limited capacity to provide services, and about half to a third of children that aren't wealthy, they're not well off necessarily, are getting their education services at private providers. And so they're a key component. So with that, I'll wrap up the talk, and I guess we'll have time to do some questions.
Okay, thank you everyone for putting questions in. I'll take them two at a time. The first one's from Samira, asking, how was the socioeconomic status of the students defined? Did you have data on the household income? And the second from Jose, is this framework for education markets also used to think about higher education, or is that market different?
On the first question, socioeconomic status in that context is determined by the Ministry of Social Planning, I guess you could say, and is based off of a household survey and administrative data. And so socioeconomic status being low is being in the 40% poorest part of the distribution. So it's a little arbitrary in the sense that basically 90% of the population is like not rich, and then the people above the median are, if they lose their job, they'll be in the poor group pretty quickly. So, but that's to answer the question. That's like a pretty. I mean, there's a whole ministry just basically focused on kind of doing that measurement correctly in the context of Chile. And the second question, yeah, I mean, this framework, I mean, thinking about supply and demand and like what people are doing, I think is actually even more relevant for higher education. Although higher education has additional interesting things that are difficult to deal with, but you could imagine higher education, providers like institutes or technical institutes or universities even, as firms that provide multiple different types of goods, and they basically, they have to choose what types of, you could think of them to make. I mean, some of these abstractions are silly, but it helps to just think clearly about the economics. Is I think a university has a bunch of different majors and different campuses. You could think of it as a company that sells cereal. They have different types of cereal, and so you have the sugar cereal, you got the healthy cereal, and if you do too many healthy cereals, they kind of take from each other. So you want to choose your product variety kind of in a way that's like convenient. And there could be economies of scale at some campus. If you have laboratories, those could be used for different types of things. And so there's some fixed costs involved. And thinking about those things is pretty interesting, especially in developing countries where traditionally the university systems were like, there was like an elite university, and then there wasn't much else. But then a lot of people suddenly started to become middle class and started to want to go to college. And then the private sector did a big part of the growth in higher ed in the developing world, since 2000 onward. I would say that's been a huge part of that. And those are responding to just people's needs for that, plus governments subsidizing demand through loans. Now, some of this like blows up in your face if you realize that people, the reason what they were choosing was they weren't very informed, then they're not going to be very good at paying back their loans because maybe they studied things that I can't pay for. And so having thought through these different frictions and these different things would have been useful when thinking about what's the best way to help people, go into higher education. And you would think, well, these private guys, they're going to offer whatever is best for them. And so if people just want to study something cheap that has no jobs and we give them loans, they're going to do it. And then later it's going to be bad. And so I think it continues to be a pretty good, I think it's a pretty good framework to start thinking about some of these things. It does, the issue with this framework is it's missing out on some things. And it also requires like a lot of measurement. We need to do a lot of like measuring and good data to be able to make it, useful kind of commentary on things. And so, but it's a useful, I think it's a useful benchmark relative to what other fields have to offer, because they have other perspectives that are useful too. But ours, as economists, we kind of come in here, this is about what we're better at, in my opinion.
Okay, we've got two questions about the research. The first is there a consensus in the literature on what kind of government intervention is the most effective? And the second, how confident are researchers on the information they provide on the returns to education?
So on the what is is there a consensus? I think it's pretty. I would say that I don't think there's a consensus in general. I think the consensus is that you really need to kind of think about the details and measure and figure things out, because it all kind of depends. I do think that there is a growing consensus that the supply side is an important aspect to consider and to think about, and it's not just about subsidizing demand or just expanding the public sector, because many times in developing countries there's very limited capacity to actually do that. I think that we're getting to a spot where we can trace out the meaningful kind of aspects that we'd want to learn about. And so you get into a place and you're thinking, well, we should pilot maybe a small scale RCT where we can see whether information or resources can shift individual choices in the ways that we think they should go. And then if that works and you've optimized that, because that could change from context to context, then you can move towards the second part where you can think about how to roll this out at scale and see kind of what effects you might get. I think we're getting to a consensus about how to operate in terms of like how to learn about what we need to learn so that we can give appropriate guidance. But I don't think there's like a silver bullet type thing. We think this is the right way to go like all the time, at least in my opinion, beyond just taking this, the supply side parts seriously. On the information part, typically the information provided in the studies that give people information, say on the returns to education, these are information that, it's basically impossible to give people information on the causal effects of education for them, which would be the relevant one, because it would be this multidimensional thing that we don't actually know what it's going to be because it's going to happen in the future. And so anything you do is a projection. What's typically done is something like we give them facts that exist in the data and you correct their beliefs, their biased beliefs about a fact in the data. Like people that graduated from college and studied engineering today in the tax agency 2 years after having graduated make 10. And the people, you ask people, how much do you think they make? And they say, I think those people make 5. And so you're like, actually, those people make 10. That doesn't necessarily mean that that person's going to make 10 if they study engineering, but it does mean that they're off on certain parameters that they would need to, for themselves, to calculate some sort of, projection of what they might make. And so what, at least, and I've seen and from the research that I've read, what we see is there's a part of this, it's like an underestimate of the average. There's also underestimate of the heterogeneity within categories. For example, within college, people typically underestimate the differences between the high earning and the low earning. So like it's just college. whereas there's actually really big differences, and these differences compound over time. And so those types of things are kind of, we're pretty confident are true. Like the differences across these things are big, and those aren't gonna go away. What people are pretty careful about not telling people like, this is this is what you're gonna make if you go to high school, because that's for sure something that we don't know. And actually add a sample. I mean, we're actually shifting somebody in that wouldn't have gone to college in the first place, or wouldn't have stayed in school.
I think we'll take two more, and these are both on digital education. So the first is, how can countries escape the digital education trap? The pandemic has increased the digital bias in education, with some countries pushing digital learning as a substitute to physical learning. And the second question, will digital tools used in schools for distance education become integral in the future?
So on the part of what can countries do or what can governments do, I think there's a part of that that's to kind of identify, this is kind of a general thing, identify what the problem is, because I feel like right now everyone's correctly, identified the fact that we don't have the infrastructure necessary, but just the internet and the devices. But I think that you have to have, there has to be like a conscious effort, like a policy, like a concerted policy that's not just about, having electricity in your house, for example. Like getting an internet is kind of a similar thing. It's to invest in the abilities and infrastructure for continual adoption and testing of new things that come down the pipeline. Because it's going to happen that we're going to have people that are connected to the internet. It's similar to in the past when people were like, well, we just need computers. And the people that give them computers, but they wouldn't know what software to use. They weren't trained to use them, or they didn't have where to charge the computers. And so it's kind of like you need the bundle, and the bundle is like a continuous effort. So I feel like taking this seriously is gonna be important, because I do think, this kind of segueing into the other question, that there is a lot of value in some of this new technology, and they have low marginal costs. There's a very big opportunity for developing countries, because we can get things that are complementary to kids' learning experience that are going to be feasible to scale up because their costs are low. But the stumbling block is going to be the adoption and the choosing which one is good and which one isn't, and adopting these things quickly, and knowing how to triage which ones are useful for which people. And as we're doing it now, at least my experience with the countries in Latin America I'm seeing now, there's a lot of crafty teachers trying to do the best they can, but they're not necessarily getting the support and the training necessary for this to be like a continued thing. Like, it's not just Zoom. It's going to be like a bunch of other stuff that is going to come down the pipeline. And the hope is that maybe some of these things that come with more AI capabilities and more personalization can be done in a way that we can, easily deploy them in the future. But those are going to need some investment. And are these things here to stay? I think they are. I think that there was already a lot of low-hanging fruit that we could take and use. And now that we've kind of gotten everyone's attention to try to adapt, to use this stuff, they're going to be able to do this in the near future, if not already. And so I think that's there. I think we have to just kind of realize that this is just like one shock, and we have a process. And so you might think, well, we're not going to be able, part of this is like, for example, trying to make teachers be an integral process of this so they can participate in this thing. It's not like replacing all the teachers, because that's one of those things that we're not going to be able to, like, the teachers have some information that we don't know about the kids. And so that's going to be something that I think figuring out how to kind of combine these two things, and what kind of training is necessary for teachers to become really digitally competent at administering these technologies and tools in a way that's going to put them to their best use. And I feel like right now that's not on the horizon. Like, people aren't thinking about that as much. they're more trying to just get out of the problem we have right now. Just survive. Just try to get the kids to learn. Just go back to school. We're still just starting to get people to go back to school. So it's early still.
I think unfortunately we're out of time for any more questions. Okay, I think that brings an end to the lecture. Thank you everyone for coming, and next week starts module 2.
Thank you. Bye.